one of the questions I always had about gypsy jazz, and I've never really, I don't know if there is an answer to this, but it's so, the genre seems so singularly focused on the contributions of one person. Mm-hmm. I never understood if this was simply the community at the time playing this music and he was the one that got famous, or is he in fact the progenitor of the style that then everyone else then institutionalized, let's say.
Yeah, this is the big question, and I was waiting for this one actually.
Okay.
It's like the one of the most controversial ones. So gypsy jazz is one of the very few genres in existence that is based entirely on the work of one person, Django Reinhardt. So Django got into jazz. He had been trained as a musician in a genre known as bal musette, which was the fad in the early part of the century in Paris and France generally, which was like a popular kind of dance music. And he grew up playing banjo guitar, which is kind of hybrid banjo and guitar, but started getting into guitar. And as soon as he started getting into jazz, he realized, this is my thing. So he taught himself how to play jazz, played with a few other jazz musicians. Do you want me to tell the Caravan Fire story?
I don't know it, actually.
Okay, well, there you go.
I feel like some of this stuff is old hat to people who study, but all I know is the fingers, and they didn't work because of the fire, and thank God there was a fire at some strange level, right?
It's a horrible blessing in disguise.
Yeah, strange.
So when he was 18, so it's in 1928, he came home to his caravan to find his wife there, who had been making these celluloid plastic flowers to sell. And they were in their caravan, and nobody knows exactly what happened, but apparently a candle fell over and the caravan went up in flames.
Okay.
And
by caravan we mean like covered wagon?
Yeah, like wooden wagon, like just on the outskirts of Paris.
Okay.
There was this whole kind of region, like basically the slums of Paris, known as La Zone, where he had his caravan stationed.
And this is not just a mode of transportation, it's where you live also?
Yeah.
Okay.
So candle got knocked over, caravan went up in flames. She was fine, her name was Bella, but his entire left side of his body just got burned. He spent a year in the hospital convalescing, and the end result was that his arm and hand got really severely burned, so that the musculature in here and all that got really messed up, and there's people who've done studies on this to see exactly what the physiology of it was. But it got so burned that these two fingers were basically curled back and more or less not usable.
The whole style really does come back to...
Yeah. And the thing so the other big part of that question that I wanted to get into a little bit is the fact that we have this genre called gypsy jazz. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people who you talk to who are very in the genre, who study it very fastidiously, ask themselves at some point, now why is it called gypsy jazz? Which might seem like a silly question at first, but it's really not, because when you look at the history of the term itself, it's actually quite controversial. So
within the community, or
within the community, and also within like Manouche, Gypsy, whatever communities as well. As Benjamin Given put it very eloquently in his book, The Music of Django Reinhardt, he insisted that Django thought of himself first and foremost as a jazz musician, and he wanted to play jazz, which is not to say that his ethnicity didn't matter to him. It actually did very much, and there are a lot of stories that attest to that he was very committed to his family and his ethnic group and everything. But musically, he was all about jazz. So first of all, this notion that he was playing something called gypsy jazz didn't even occur to him.
He didn't use the term?
No.
So far as we know?
Never.
So when did the term come to popular usage?
So the first recorded use of that term specifically to refer to a style of music didn't appear until the late 1950s in French literature. Okay. And then it was called jazz tzigane or jazz gitan.
Right.
Gitan is like kind of the equivalent of gypsy, and tzigane's like a little bit slightly less pejorative.
Is that another ethnic group, or that's a slang term?
It's all basically the same thing. It just means generally gypsy. And so that came about to describe the people who followed Django after his death, because he died in 1953. So
this was another external application of identity by music critics or press.
Yeah, like there are some, you can find some reviews of Django performances, contemporary reviews that say, this like...
That gypsy guy.
Gypsy. Yeah, he's playing this crazy gypsy jazz, but not actually as a genre, just to say like he's a gypsy and he's playing this.
And the term stuck, basically.
And the term started sticking a few years after he died.
Okay. Which was when?
1953 is when he died, and then the first usage that I'm aware of is in 1959, an article by a critic named Jean-Claude Jallard. So the term didn't actually come into colloquial use, as far as we know, until probably the early 1970s.
Okay.
And then it just kind of took off from there and became known as jazz manouche, pertaining particularly to the manouche subgroup,
Right.
who were the ones who were like the main carriers of that. Which bring me to the second aspect of the term gypsy jazz, which is that even if Django didn't conceive of gypsy jazz and didn't really think anything was gypsy about it, I mean, musicologically speaking, it's very difficult to pinpoint what is actually gypsy about the sound.
So the time when he created or conceived his own jazz style, which eventually became a thing we now call gypsy jazz, did the Gypsies have any particular heritage with guitar music, or was other music being played on guitars, and that's why he was the guitar player?
All kinds of music were being played on guitars, like Romani specific genres, especially like Russian music, for example. There's a whole like very rich history of Russian guitar playing, Russian Romani guitar playing. But in terms of technique, Django was kind of pioneering basically his own thing based in a jazz idiom with whatever, and we're not totally sure because there aren't recordings of this, but whatever influences came from his family, from other manouche players. But it's really hard to pin that down because we just don't know what was going on within.
So it's not even really like there was a community of gypsy guitarists that were playing jazz at the time, and that he was just sort of maybe applied a little more synthesis. It really is, here's a guy who showed up and said, you know, I'd really like to play popular jazz in the style of Charlie Christian or whoever was active at the time, threw in his own stew, created his own little stew, and then that kind of became.
Yeah, which is not to forget about his accompanists, who were also very important to that scene, a number of whom were actually Gypsy, Romani in origin.
In the band at the Hot Club.
Yeah, so he had, the Hot Club, the Quintet du Hot Club de France, had kind of a rotating cast of characters. Django was always in it, but then there were lots of other musicians. One musician that he played with quite frequently was his own brother, who's his rhythm guitarist, like one of his most trusted rhythm guitarists. And then there were some other people who were not necessarily manouche, but of the Gitan subgroup who had resettled into Paris. So they had kind of lost touch with that like Spanish element of it, and were mainly like Parisian-based Gitan. That was the Ferré family.
Okay.
And three of those, there were three brothers, Saran, Barrow, and Matelot. And they were also like very close to Django and accompanied him on a lot of recordings.
So they contributed to this style as he conceived it, or they were already playing in some melange of influences themselves?
It was kind of a symbiosis as well. Like they were learning jazz the same time he was, and this was all new too, because I mean, you know, Django became famous in the early 1930s, right when swing was becoming a big thing, and then during the interwar period, or during the wartime period, it kind of became its own thing in Paris because you couldn't really import records from America where all this music was like really taking off, so they kind of made their own brand of swing music.
So, and the pomp rhythm, for example, was that a bal musette thing, or where did they get that?
Yeah, so that the most well agreed upon conclusion on that is that when you were playing these acoustic guitars before they had access to electric amplification, you just had to like play the hell out of those instruments so that you could actually make enough sound so that people could dance to it.
Right. So they just chose something that was punchy.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah.
But that was again a Django creation, or the Hot Club creation.
It existed to a certain extent prior to that, but you know, he just kind of took that rhythm and made it more well known because of, you know, all sorts of things, but mainly like his own celebrity kind of elevated that.
And all the other ticks that we sort of associate with the style, like the aggressive vibrato, and that was all. Were these were his phrasings, or where did these things come from?
Mainly, yeah. And you know, there are other musicians who were doing other things who didn't, or similar things who didn't make it nearly as famous as he did. But yeah, there are like particular phrasings, particular like certain ornamentations and all that have been attributed uniquely to Django, or at least the way that he put them together.